Alina Ward pushed open the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse, unsure what the day would bring, but determined not to show it. She had stood in tougher places before, places where every step could mean danger. Yet somehow this quiet building, with polished floors and soft echoes, felt more threatening than any rough terrain she had faced in her years of service. Maybe it was because this time she wasn't fighting for a mission. She was fighting for her dignity. She kept her posture straight as she walked down the hallway. The faint tapping of her boots mixed with the hushed conversations around her. A few people looked at her, then quickly looked away. Others stared longer, whispering to each other as if they already knew her story without ever hearing it from her. Alina wasn't surprised. For weeks leading up to this, she had heard the same comments. Some people said she was too cold. Others claimed she was exaggerating her service record. A few even believed she was using her background to gain sympathy. Alina had tried to ignore it, but the rumors grew louder with every passing day. Today was supposed to settle things. Today she finally had the chance to explain herself. But as she walked into the courtroom, she realized things might not be that simple. The room was quiet, with tall windows letting in the late morning light. The judge sat at the front, flipping through a stack of papers. The opposing lawyer, a man in an expensive suit, was already standing near his table. He glanced at Alina the moment she stepped inside, tilting his head slightly as though evaluating her. Alina didn't react. She simply moved to her seat, placed her documents neatly in front of her, and took a slow breath. She knew better than to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her uneasy. But inside, she felt the tension tighten. She wasn't afraid, but she was tired. Tired of being misunderstood. Tired of having to prove herself. Tired of people assuming things about her without knowing what she had lived through. A few moments passed before the judge finally looked up. He didn't smile or greet her. Instead, he tapped his pen and said, "We will begin shortly." His tone wasn't rude, but it wasn't welcoming either. It felt like she was already being judged before she even spoke. While the court staff prepared the documents, Lena noticed the whispers starting up again. The opposing lawyer leaned toward his assistant, speaking softly, but not softly enough. "So that's her," he murmured. "Doesn't look like what she claims." His assistant chuckled under her breath. "I thought she'd be taller." Lena kept her eyes forward, pretending she hadn't heard it. She had dealt with comments like that before from strangers, from skeptics, sometimes even from people she served alongside. She could handle it. But what bothered her wasn't the words. It was the intention behind them. They weren't just doubting her. They were trying to shape the room's opinion of her before the hearing even started. When the judge called the session to order, the opposing lawyer immediately stepped forward. He spoke with confidence, almost overly smooth, as though he was telling a story rather than presenting facts. He began by questioning Elena's background in a tone that made everything sound uncertain. "There are claims," he said, emphasizing the word, "that Miss Ward spent several years in military service. However, we have found some inconsistencies in her records." Alina felt a small twist in her stomach. She knew exactly where this was going. They were going to take pieces of her life, pieces she had risked everything for, and twist them just enough to create doubt. The lawyer continued. "Some documents are missing. Some statements are unclear. We even found reports that suggest she may not have completed her service honorably." The judge raised an eyebrow at that. "Is that so?" Alina opened her mouth to speak, but the judge held up a hand. "You'll have your turn." She closed her mouth slowly, forcing herself to stay calm. The lawyer handed a pile of papers to the judge. "And, if the court allows, I will also present a few statements from individuals who believe Miss Ward has exaggerated parts of her career." The judge nodded. Flipping through the pages, Alina felt heat rising in her chest. Not anger, frustration. She had expected resistance, but not this level of manipulation. She could recognize edited documents from a mile away. She knew some of the reports weren't real, or at least not presented truthfully. But she also knew how carefully the opposing side had chosen their words. They weren't accusing her outright. They were planting small seeds of doubt. It was a strategy she had seen used in interrogations and negotiations, and now it was being used on her. When the judge finally looked at her, his expression was unreadable. "Miss Ward, you may respond." Lena stood. She didn't rush. She didn't raise her voice. She simply spoke the way she always had, clear, steady, and honest. "My records are real," she said. "I served for many years. I completed every requirement. I have nothing to hide." The opposing lawyer smirked slightly. "Then why are some documents incomplete?" Alina didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on the judge. "Some parts of my service are restricted. That's why certain files are not available." The lawyer laughed lightly. "Convenient." Alina finally turned to him. "It's not convenient. It's protocol. And you know that." The judge tapped his pen again. "Miss Ward, do you have proof to support your statements?" She hesitated. Not because she didn't have proof, but because she didn't have the full clearance to present everything. Some operations she had been part of were classified. She couldn't discuss them, not even here. "I've submitted everything I'm allowed to share," she replied. The judge didn't respond immediately. His silence stretched across the room like a slow-moving shadow. The opposing lawyer took advantage of the pause. "Your Honor, with all due respect, if she cannot provide full documentation, how can we believe her? Anyone can claim to have served. Anyone can say their records are classified. But if she can't offer evidence, we must assume there's more to the story." The judge leaned back in his chair. "Miss Ward, do you have anything else?" Alina shook her head once. "Not at this moment." The lawyer folded his arms, looking satisfied, almost smug. It was a small expression, but it carried the clear message. He believed he had won this round. Alina returned to her seat quietly. She didn't slump. She didn't show defeat. But inside, she felt a dull ache settling in. No matter how much she had done for her country, no matter how many sacrifices she had made, here she was treated like a liar because she didn't have the right file in her hand. She stared at the table in front of her. For a moment, she wondered if this was all a mistake. Maybe she should have fought differently. Maybe she should have pushed harder to get approval for certain documents. Maybe she should have brought someone who could vouch for her. But she reminded herself that she had followed every rule. She hadn't broken any protocols. She had done everything the right way, and still it wasn't enough around her. The opposing side continued whispering, confident they had taken control of the room. The judge's face remained unreadable as he reviewed the documents. Alina sat there, trying to stay steady. But the weight of everything she had carried for years pressed harder on her shoulders. She closed her eyes for a brief moment. She wasn't giving up. She wasn't defeated. She just needed strength. She needed patience. She needed the truth to find its way through the noise. But for now, alone in that courtroom, surrounded by doubt and quiet accusations, all she could do was sit and wait. She didn't know that the moment she felt most alone was the moment things were about to change. She didn't know someone was already on their ways, someone who knew the truth better than anyone. And when that person walked through those courtroom doors, everything would shift. But Alina couldn't see that yet, not here. Not in this moment, with all eyes on her and every whisper trying to tear her down. All she could do was steady her breath, lift her chin, and hold herself together. Because no matter what they tried to take from her today, she wasn't going to break. Alina sat in the courtroom listening as the opposing lawyer continued to speak, each word sharper than the last. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap, her shoulders steady. But inside she felt the weight of every accusation pressing down on her. She had been through many difficult moments in her life, but nothing had prepared her for the slow and calculated attempt to tear apart her character in front of strangers. The lawyer lifted another paper with a dramatic pause, as though he was revealing some kind of shocking truth. "Your Honor, this report suggests there were disciplinary concerns during her time of service. It makes us question her reliability and stability." The judge took the paper, adjusting his glasses as he read. Alina could tell he was trying to hide his reaction, but the slight twitch of his eyebrow told her enough. Whatever was written there wasn't true, or at least not presented honestly. She wanted to speak, to explain, but she also knew that interrupting would only make things worse. What bothered her wasn't just the false claims. It was how easily a room of people who had never walked a step in her shoes, were willing to believe the worst. She wondered if they even cared about the truth, or if this was simply a performance to them. After a long pause, the judge looked at her. "Miss Ward, you may respond to this particular claim." Lena stood slowly. She took a breath, reminding herself to stay calm and speak clearly. "Your Honor, that report is taken out of context. The situation it refers to was resolved, and the details they are leaving out change everything. I followed the rules. I followed every instruction given to me at the time." The opposing lawyer stepped forward. "Yet somehow, we only have your word for that. There is no supporting documentation. Isn't that convenient?" Alina turned her head slightly. "It's not convenient. It's the truth. Some situations simply don't leave behind the kind of paperwork you're demanding, and you know that well." The lawyer smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't warm at all. "Or perhaps you'd like the court to believe that everything missing from your record is simply because of restriction or poor documentation. That seems like quite a coincidence." Alina didn't respond. She knew anything she said would be twisted again, so she simply returned to her seat, choosing silence over unnecessary conflict. The opposing lawyer handed more documents to the judge, pages filled with half-truths, guesses and statements from people Alina barely knew, people who weren't there when she worked long hours, who didn't understand why certain missions were never discussed openly, who had never seen her risk her life for the sake of others. Yet now these same people were being used to create a narrative that painted her as unreliable. The judge took his time flipping through the pages. Silence filled the room, heavy and uncomfortable. Even the air felt thick, as though the walls themselves were waiting to hear what would come next. As Alina waited, she let her eyes drift to the window. The sunlight outside looked warm and free, a sharp contrast to the cold tension inside the courtroom. She missed that feeling of freedom of stepping outside into open air, knowing she had done something meaningful. Her work had once given her a purpose she couldn't describe to most people. But here she was now, being judged by people who didn't know the first thing about the things she had done. The judge finally cleared his throat. "Miss Ward, I need assurance that your statements are accurate. Without clear documentation, it is difficult for the court to rely solely on your words." Lena nodded. "I understand. But I can only share what I'm allowed to share. If I break protocol, that becomes an entirely different issue, and I refuse to do that." The opposing lawyer crossed his arms. "So you see, Your Honor, we're stuck in a situation where we have claims, but no proof. It doesn't paint a reassuring picture. In fact, it raises more questions than answers." The judge tapped his pen against the table, again a habit he did whenever he was thinking. "Miss Ward, is there absolutely no one who can verify any part of your service? No one who can confirm the nature of your duties or your conduct?" Alina felt her heart tighten. There were people who could. People who had stood beside her. People who trusted her and whom she trusted in return. But those people were far away, engaged in work even more restricted than hers. She had tried contacting a few, but they were unreachable for now. She knew they would come if they could. But she also knew she couldn't rely on what-ifs. "Not at this moment, Your Honor," she answered quietly. The opposing lawyer nodded slowly, as though he had expected this. "Then I believe the court has every reason to question her credibility. A decorated past is a nice story, but stories without evidence are just that, stories." Alina felt heat building in her chest again, but she didn't let it reach her face. She had faced tougher people than him, people with more training, more strategy, more power. But here, in this world of suits and paperwork, her experience held no weight. The judge sighed lightly. "Let us continue. Present your next item." The opposing lawyer didn't waste a moment. He lifted a picture on old photograph Alina recognized immediately. It was from a time when she was in a different city, working undercover. She looked tired in the photos, her clothes covered in dust, her expression hard. "This image, Your Honor, shows her in a situation that she claims was official work. Yet we found no matching records, no mission reports, no documentation. In fact, the only information we've found is her own personal account." Again, convenient. The judge examined the photograph. "Miss Ward, when was this taken? And under what circumstances?" Alina swallowed. This was one of those moments she had feared. She couldn't tell the whole truth. She couldn't reveal who had been with her, what they were tracking, or how the mission ended. The details were restricted. It's from a past assignment, she said. I can't explain more than that. The opposing lawyer spread his hands. And there we have it. More half-answers. More unexplained events. Your Honor, we cannot make decisions based on guesswork and incomplete stories. Alina closed her eyes for just a moment. She felt the walls closing in. She felt the doubt growing thicker with every word spoken. She wondered how much longer she would have to sit there, listening to strangers shape her life into something she barely recognized. As the hearing moved forward, the lawyer continued picking apart every piece of her past. He questioned her deployments, her achievements, even her physical and emotional endurance. He implied she was unstable, stressed, possibly unreliable due to her past experiences, even though he had no proof of any of it. Every time he made a statement, his voice carried an air of authority, as though he was certain he understood her better than she understood herself. Alina kept listening. She kept breathing. She kept her posture strong, but deep down, she felt a sharp sting, the kind that didn't come from anger but from disappointment. Not in herself, but in the system that was supposed to be fair. After almost an hour of these pointed attacks, the judge called for a short break. The room slowly emptied, leaving Alina alone at her table. She didn't stand right away. She let the silence settle and tried to gather her thoughts. She stared at the papers in front of her papers that told only a small, incomplete part of her story. She had done everything by the book. She had followed every rule. She had risked her life more times than she cared to count. Yet none of that seemed to matter. She reached for her water bottle, took a slow sip, and let out a long breath. She felt exhausted not physically, but emotionally. The kind of exhaustion that comes from having to defend who you are again and again. The break ended, and people began trickling back into the room. The opposing lawyer looked refreshed, confident. His assistant adjusted her notes, whispering something to him that made him smile. Alina sat quietly, preparing herself for another round of questions she couldn't fully answer, but deep in her heart, she carried a hope she didn't dare speak out loud. A hope that anyone might arrive who could help her tell the truth. Someone who had seen the real work she had done. Someone who understood the silence she was forced to keep. She didn't know if that would happen today. She didn't know if help was even possible, but she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't going to break, no matter how hard they tried to tear her down. She would not lose the strength that had carried her through far worse challenges than this courtroom. The judge returned to his seat. The session resumed, and Alina prepared herself for the next. Attempt to discredit her and aware that the turning point she desperately needed was already making its way toward her. Step by step, closer than she realized, the hearing resumed after the break. But the atmosphere in the courtroom had changed slightly. The judge seemed more alert, the opposing lawyer looked even more confident, and Alina felt an odd heaviness in her chest, as something important was coming, though she didn't know what. She straightened her back and prepared herself for the next round. The opposing lawyer wasted no time. He stepped toward the center of the room, carrying another thick folder. "Your Honor," he began, "we have additional information that raises further questions about Miss Ward's history. These are statements from individuals who interacted with her during her service years. While some of these accounts are informal, they provide valuable insight into her behavior and reliability." Alina felt a tired ache settle behind her eyes. She knew what these statements would be: half memories, misunderstandings, and exaggerations from people who had never known her well. But she didn't interrupt. She had already learned that speaking too quickly only worked against her. The lawyer began reading the first statement, his voice slow and deliberate. One individual states that Miss Ward often kept to herself, avoided questions, and refused to explain her actions. This suggests a pattern of secrecy that may indicate unstable behavior. Alina almost smiled at the irony. Of course she had kept to herself. That had been part of her work. That had been required. But explaining that was nearly impossible without discussing things she wasn't allowed to reveal. The judge looked up. "Miss Ward, do you have a response?" She nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. My work required confidentiality. I wasn't allowed to talk openly about what I was doing." The opposing lawyer quickly added, "Convenient answer for everything, isn't it?" Alina ignored him. The judge didn't say anything more. but his expression suggested he was still trying to piece things together. The lawyer moved on to another paper. This next statement claims Miss Ward would disappear for hours or days without explanation, causing confusion among her peers. Alina looked up at that. Your Honor, those were assignments. I followed orders. I never left without permission. The judge raised a hand to quiet her. Let him finish. Alina sat down again. She was getting used to the rhythm of this hearing, the accusations, the half-truths, the twisting of her past, but inside she felt exhaustion growing like a slow burn. The lawyer continued reading, each line more dramatic than the last. He made it sound as though Alina had lived a chaotic life, full of suspicious behavior and unexplained choices. He didn't mention the structure, the discipline, the long hours, the sacrifices she had made. He didn't mention the times she had saved people or prevented disasters. Those were not things she could put into public records, Your Honor, the lawyer said, placing the last paper down with all these doubts. How can we possibly believe her story? How can we trust the version she presents? She has no one here to verify anything she says. No witnesses. No colleagues. Nothing. The judge leaned forward slightly. Miss Ward, is there truly no one who can support your account? Alina opened her mouth to answer, but the words felt heavy. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to say that many people could vouch for her, people she had trained with, people she had saved, people who understood her work, but none of them were here. None of them could even be reached, and for the first time in the entire hearing, Alina felt something close to helplessness. I don't have anyone available today, she said quietly. The opposing lawyer spread his hands as if the case had been settled. Your Honor, I believe that says everything. A faint murmur passed through the courtroom. People exchanged looks. Some even nodded slightly, so the lawyer's words confirmed their thoughts. Alina stared at the table, her breathing slow but steady. She refused to break. She refused to let these people see how deeply the injustice struck her. She had learned long ago that strength wasn't always loud. Sometimes it came in silence, in endurance. The judge turned to the lawyer. Continue. The lawyer lifted one last file, a thin one, but he held it with the confidence of someone ready to deliver a final blow. Your Honor, this document mentions an incident during Miss Ward's service where she failed to submit a report. When asked about it later, she claimed the details were classified, but we found no record of any classified operation matching her timeline. This raises questions about whether she was truthful in her explanation. The judge looked at Alina with a deeper crease in his forehead. Miss Ward, can you explain this? Alina kept her voice even. I submitted all reports required of me. What they are referring to is a summary report that was withheld by command. I wasn't the one responsible for filing it. The lawyer stepped forward slightly. Do you have proof? Alina paused. No, not here. The lawyer nodded as though she had admitted guilt. Exactly. The judge leaned back in his chair, looking tired. Miss Ward, this is becoming complicated. Without a reliable witness or more documentation, the court is left with assumptions and incomplete answers. Your Honor, I'm telling the truth. The judge's voice softened only slightly. I'm not saying you're lying, but the court needs confirmation, and so far, I haven't seen enough. A soft wave of disappointment moved across the room, some subtle, some openly visible. The opposing lawyer turned and whispered something to his assistant again. She responded with a smug smile. Alina looked at them, then at the judge, and finally at the empty doorway. She felt a small hope flicker inside her, hope that someone would walk through that door and help her. But she didn't expect it. She had learned long ago not to rely on miracles. The opposing lawyer cleared his throat again. Your Honor, with this lack of evidence, I suggest we move toward concluding the matter. I don't believe continuing will change anything. The judge seemed to be considering this. Alina felt something inside her sink. Was this how everything would end? Not with truth, but with assumptions. Not with fairness, but with misinterpretation. Suddenly, just as the judge opened his mouth to speak, the doors at the back of the courtroom creaked open. Everyone turned. A man stepped inside, dressed in a neat government-issued suit. His posture was straight, his steps deliberate, and his calm presence immediately drew the room's attention. He wasn't rushing, but the certainty in his movements made it clear he had come for a purpose. Alina blinked, sure if her eyes were playing tricks on her. She knew that face. She knew that quiet confidence. She hadn't seen him in a long time, but she could never forget the person who had once guided her. Through some of the hardest moments of her life, the opposing lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Suddenly less confident than before, his assistant stopped writing mid-sentence. The man approached the front of the courtroom without hesitation. He didn't interrupt loudly. He didn't make a dramatic entrance. He simply stood near one of the empty benches, waiting politely for the judge to acknowledge him. The judge looked surprised. "Sir, may I help you?" The man nodded. "Your Honor, I am here in regard to Miss Ward. My office was informed of the hearing, and I believe I can offer some clarity on the matters being discussed." The opposing lawyer quickly stepped forward. "Your Honor, I have no information about this individual." I don't think the judge raised a hand to silence him. "And you are?" he asked the man. The man reached into his jacket and pulled out an identification card. It wasn't the kind of card people saw every day. It bore an official seal that instantly changed the temperature of the entire room. The judge's eyes widened slightly. "I see. Please, take a seat. The court will hear what you have to say." The man nodded once and moved to sit near the front. Alina watched him with a mix of shock and relief she couldn't hide. She didn't know how he had found out about the hearing. She didn't know why he had come. But she knew one thing. If anyone could speak the truth in a way this court would finally understand, it was him. The opposing lawyer looked rattled for the first time. His confidence had slipped. He wasn't sure what to say or how to respond. The judge looked between the man and Alina. "Miss Ward, you know this individual?" Alina nodded gently. "Yes, Your Honor. Very well." The judge set his pen down. "Then perhaps we should continue with his input." And in that moment, the entire room, every whisper, every doubt, every assumption, began to shift. Alina didn't know exactly what he would say, but she knew he understood her service, her silence, and her truth in a way no one else could explain. For the first time since the hearing started, she felt the tight pressure in her chest loosen, just a little. Someone had finally come. Someone who could help her tell the truth in the courtroom. Once filled with doubt, felt as though it was holding its breath, waiting for what would come next. The morning of the next hearing came quietly, almost too quietly, as if the city itself held its breath. She woke before sunrise, the way she had trained herself to do years ago. When early mornings meant discipline, structure, and preparing for challenges that pushed both mind and body, now she faced a challenge that felt different from anything she had known. A courtroom was not a battlefield, but somehow it felt just as tense. She moved through her small apartment slowly, taking her time as she got ready. The sound of the kettle boiling filled the silence. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window. Outside, the sky was still a pale gray, the world not fully awake. She watched a few early commuters walk by, their steps steady and unhurried. For a moment, she wished she could trade places with them, even just for a day. She wished she could be someone who didn't have to defend herself again and again. But she had learned long ago that wishing didn't change reality. Action did. She took a slow drink of her tea, letting the warmth settle inside her chest. She folded her hands and tried to steady her breathing. She reminded herself of what had happened the previous day. The way the attorney had tried to paint her as someone she wasn't. The way whispers filled the room as soon as she walked in. The way the judge had remained cold and unreadable. She remembered the frustration in her stomach as she tried to speak calmly while others tried to twist her story yet. She also remembered the moment when the quiet man in the back of the room entered and everything shifted. She didn't know exactly who he was yet, but something about his presence, the way he carried himself, and the sharp confidence in his eyes made it clear he wasn't just another spectator. He had recognized her. More importantly, he had recognized what was being done to her. That small moment had stayed with her through the night. She didn't know why he had stepped in, or why he seemed to understand what she had been through. But for the first time in months, she felt like she wasn't completely alone. After finishing her tea, She stood and smoothed her jacket. She caught her reflection in the mirror near the door. There were faint shadows under her eyes, but there was also determination. She had been through worse and survived. She could get through this too. She locked the door behind her and stepped into the crisp morning air. The streetlights were still on, casting a soft glow across the quiet road. She walked at a steady pace, her mind focused but her emotions swirling. As she reached the courthouse steps, she paused. She looked up at the building's tall columns and the heavy doors. Every time she came here, it felt like walking into a place that didn't want her. But she wasn't turning back. Inside, the hallways were quiet. Only a few staff members moved around, preparing for the day. She sat on a bench outside the courtroom and folded her hands in her lap. She closed her eyes for a moment. "You came early again," a voice said. She opened her eyes and turned to see the man from yesterday standing near the wall. He wore a simple suit, nothing flashy, but he carried himself with an ease that most people didn't have. Today, he seemed even more focused. "You also came early," she replied. He gave a small smile. Some things are worth showing up early for. She didn't quite know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded. There was a brief silence before he spoke again. "I'm staying today. I already made arrangements." She looked at him, surprised. "You don't have to do that. This isn't your fight." "Maybe not," he said gently. "But someone should be here who isn't trying to break you down." His words touched something deep inside her, something tired, something bruised. She didn't know what to say. She simply breathed. Before more could be said, voices started filling the hallway as more people arrived. The attorney who had questioned her the day before walked in with a stack of papers, talking loudly to someone beside him. He saw her sitting there and smirked. It wasn't loud or obvious, but it carried the same message it always did. He thought he was winning. The judge arrived shortly after, walking past without acknowledging anyone. The courtroom door opened. People began to take their seats. She felt the familiar pressure in her chest as she stepped inside. She kept her head up. The man followed behind her and took the same seat he had taken the previous day. A few people noticed him, whispering to each other, as if unsure of who he was or why he was there. The hearing began. The attorney stood quickly, already prepared to continue where he had left off. He spoke in a sharp tone, trying to paint her decisions as reckless. He twisted her words and pointed out small details as if they were crimes. Every time she answered, he tried to interrupt or undermine her, but this time, something was different. She didn't waver. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't shrink back. She spoke steadily, clearly, and calmly. She remembered the man's words, "Someone should be here who isn't trying to break you down." That thought alone kept her grounded. At one point, the attorney tried to bring up something completely unrelated to the case. He began insinuating things, stretching the truth, and using her service history as a way to create doubt about her character. But before he could go too far, a strong voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The entire room fell silent. Even the judge looked up in surprise. It was the man. He stood from his seat, calm but firm, his posture straight and authoritative. He walked toward the front of the courtroom with controlled, measured steps. "Who are you?" the attorney demanded, irritated. The man reached the center of the room and paused. "Someone who knows exactly who she is," he said. "And someone who won't stand by while you twist her service into something it wasn't." A ripple moved through the courtroom. People whispered, leaning in. The judge narrowed her eyes. "If you plan to speak, you need to identify yourself." He nodded once, then reached into his jacket and presented a neatly folded identification card. The judge's expression changed instantly. So did the attorney's. A few people in the audience gasped. She watched, stunned. Unsure of what was happening, she had guessed he was connected to the military in some way. But she never imagined this. The judge took a moment to read the identification and then exhaled slowly. "I see." The courtroom was so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. The man turned slightly, just enough to meet her eyes. He didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply stood there steady, supportive, and unshaken. And for the first time since this entire process began, she felt the room shift in her favor. The judge cleared her throat and addressed the attorney. "Proceed carefully and stay relevant to the case." Gosh. The attorney swallowed hard and nodded stiffly. She felt a warmth wash over her, a mixture of relief, gratitude, and something deeper she couldn't name yet. She looked at the man again, and though he didn't say a word, the message in his eyes was clear. He wasn't going anywhere, and the people who had tried so hard to break her were finally starting to realize they couldn't. She sat up straighter, folded her hands, and prepared to face whatever came next. The courtroom felt different the next morning. The air was still heavy with tension, but something beneath it had shifted. People who had walked into the hearings earlier with doubt in their eyes now watched her with quiet curiosity, even respect. She felt it as soon as she stepped through the tall wooden doors. No one whispered this time. No one smirked. It was as if the whole room had finally realized she was not someone they could push around. The man who had stepped in the day before was already there, sitting in the same seat near the back. His posture was straight, his expression calm, but there was a sharp alertness in his eyes. When she entered, he looked at her with a steady nod. It wasn't a smile, but it carried the same warmth. A silent reassurance. She felt her chest loosen. Even just knowing he was there made the room feel less hostile. As she waited for the judge, she took a slow breath, grounding herself. She had endured these hearings for weeks. She had been questioned, doubted, and pushed to her limits. But something about today felt final, not because the struggle was ending, but because she was ready for whatever came next. The judge entered, her expression more serious than usual. She sat down, adjusted her glasses, and tapped the table lightly. "Let's proceed." The attorney stood quickly, though his confidence from earlier days was noticeably missing. He wasn't as loud. He didn't rush his words. He kept glancing toward the man sitting in the back, as if unsure whether he would step in again. She almost wanted to tell him that the man didn't need to say anything. His presence alone had already changed everything. The attorney asked a few more questions. It's nothing as sharp or personal as before. Mostly procedural details. She answered calmly, her voice steady. She didn't feel the tightness in her throat anymore. She didn't feel cornered. For the first time, she felt in control. When the attorney finished, he sat down quickly, relief washing over his face like someone who had just finished walking across a thin sheet of ice. The judge turned her attention to her. "Do you have anything you'd like to add before I make my decision?" She hesitated. Not because she didn't have anything to say, but because she wanted to choose her words carefully. She folded her hands on the table. "Yes," she said softly. "I'd like to say something." The room went quiet. She took a steady breath before speaking again. "I didn't come here expecting to be treated gently. I understand these things can be difficult. But I didn't expect to be treated like someone who couldn't be trusted with her own story. I've spent years serving this country. I've made mistakes like any human being. But I've also fought hard to stand here with honesty and courage." A few people nodded. Even the judge's expression softened slightly. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she continued. "I'm asking to be seen fairly. That's all I want." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look around the room. She spoke as if it were just her and the judge. Once she finished, she sat quietly, her hands still folded. The judge leaned back, thoughtful. She didn't speak immediately. Instead, she looked down at her papers, then back at the woman standing before her. "This court appreciates your honesty," the judge finally said, "and your service." The silence that followed was thick, everyone waiting. Then the judge delivered her decision. It was fair, it was balanced, and most importantly, it cleared her name. The courtroom didn't erupt or cheer, but there was a noticeable shift, an invisible release of pressure, like a curtain falling at the end of a long performance. She let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Her shoulders relaxed, and for the first time in months, she felt a quiet sense of victory. She didn't smile right away. She simply closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the relief settle into her bones. When she opened them, the man was already standing. People looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and admiration, still unsure of who he was exactly. But to her, he He was simply someone who had seen her when others had tried not to. As she walked out of the courtroom, he followed at a short distance. She stepped into the hallway, leaning against the wall for a moment, still processing everything. "You did well," he said softly as he approached. She looked up at him. "I didn't do it alone." He shook his head. "You would have done it even if I wasn't here." "Maybe," she murmured. "But it helped to know someone believed me." Didn't respond immediately. He just stood there, hands in his pockets, looking at her with a calm understanding. "So," she said after a moment, trying to lighten her expression, "are you going to tell me who you really are?" His lips lifted, just slightly. "Someday," he said. "But today's about you." She huffed a gentle laugh. "Avoiding the question again?" "Not avoiding," he replied, "just choosing the right time." They walked outside together. The sunlight hit her face, warm and bright, almost blinding after days spent inside courtrooms and offices. For the first time, she let herself breathe deeply. People passed by without staring. The world felt normal again, something she hadn't felt in a long time. She stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, looking out at the busy street. "I don't know what happens next," she admitted. "That's the best part," he said quietly. "You get to decide now." She turned to him. "Will I see you again?" He looked at her for a long moment, steady, thoughtful. "If you want to." There was something in his voice. Not a promise, not a commitment. But a door left open, she nodded slowly, feeling something warm settle in her chest. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "You don't owe me thanks." "Maybe not," she replied. "But I mean it anyway." He gave a gentle nod, then stepped back, giving her space. She watched him for a moment before turning to walk down the street. Her steps felt lighter than they had in months. She didn't know where she was going. She didn't have a plan yet, but she didn't feel afraid. For the first time in a long time, she felt free from judgment, free from doubt, free to rebuild herself. And she knew one thing clearly: no matter how hard people had tried to tear her down, she had stood her ground, she had walked into the fire, and she had come out stronger as she moved forward. The sound of the courthouse doors closing behind her felt like the end of a long and painful chapter. What waited ahead wasn't certain, but it was hers, and she was ready for it.